Hello listeners, this talk is going to be about how leftists don't understand complex systems. There have been a number of occasions recently that have prompted me to make this talk. I think I will make more individual talks about particular issues, so this may just be a little bit of an overview, but nevertheless, various things have led me to consider this issue. Now, it's quite ironic that in many cases leftists don't actually understand complex systems, because this is something that leftists often accuse people on the right of not being able to understand or being unaware of these kinds of things, particularly when it comes to the environment. Leftists will often talk about how what's it called, climate change or global warming or various other environmental issues revolve around very complex systems, and humans meddle in these systems and they don't understand what their meddling will do, and they cause all sorts of problems as a result. Now, they seem to be able to apply this kind of reasoning to do with complex systems to those kinds of instances, but either they are unable to or unwilling to apply the same kind of reasoning to some other complex systems. And I think there are many of those systems, many man-made systems indeed. Maybe it's because they think they're man-made systems that they're not in the same league as something such as the environment, though I don't think so. So what I would like to do here is just discuss a few of these very briefly, and then, as I said, I will probably get into some of these in more detail in other talks. So, given that they can recognize that these complex systems occur in nature, for instance, why is it that they can't, or why don't they recognize that human systems, traditions, culture, all of these kinds of things are actually quite complex systems as well, with many different parts, and that if you meddle with those things, if you remove one thing, if you change one thing, then you can upset the entire system. Just in the same way that if you meddle with one thing in a natural system, if you add an organism, remove an organism, add this chemical, remove that chemical, whatever, you can upset a particular balance there as well. Now, before I get into that, I'd like to just mention the trichotomy, what's known as the trichotomy in neo-reaction. Most people are probably fairly familiar with this, but there may be some people who don't know what that is. So neo-reaction, the movement of neo-reaction, is, in some ways, it's actually three movements that have somewhat of an unholy alliance. What they all seem to have in common is that they dislike the current state of affairs, politically and culturally and so on. And sometimes they find common ground, at other times they don't agree fully. So these three branches are traditionalists, sometimes called Christian traditionalists. They're very much focused upon religion and tradition, obviously. Then there are ethno-nationalists, and they're very much focused upon race, and you could perhaps say to a certain extent culture as well, but particularly race. And then there are the techno-commercialists, and these people, many of them are sort of post-libertarian. They're very much into the free market and capitalism and so on. They recognize there are some problems with that. And some of them are also very much into sort of science fiction type ideas to do with artificial intelligence and this kind of thing as well. Nevertheless, each of these three branches could actually pick out many issues where leftists don't understand complex systems and are meddling in complex systems. So I'll just mention a few of these briefly, and as I mentioned before, I may go into some of these in greater detail in other talks. So for the traditionalists, one of the big issues that they have real problems with leftists over is sex relations. So the relationship between men and women. So obviously you've got things like feminism there. That's a big one for them. And sort of the breakdown in traditional roles and that kind of stuff. Now, leftists well, they very much think, oh, well, we should overturn patriarchy and all the rest of this. And we should overturn religious mores and all the rest of it. We can define gender and so on and so forth. What they don't seem to think about is that many of these traditions, they didn't just come out of nowhere. These are things that have occurred. Someone didn't just say one day, okay, we're going to do this thing. It rarely works that way. It's rarely top down. Usually it's bottom up. It's very organic. It occurs over a long period of time. And these systems develop. They're very slow to develop. They're highly complex in the way that they develop as well. There are many different parts. And you could actually think of these traditions as being an ecosystem or something along those lines, where if you change one thing, you can very much upset the whole thing. Or if you remove one thing, you can't necessarily just replace that thing that you remove with another thing. It doesn't work that way. Everything is in a state of, well, not equilibrium as such, because everything in the world is always in flux, but when viewed from a long way away, or when viewed over a long period of time, you can see that, but up close, things seem to be quite stable. They change slowly, generally speaking. Now, leftists don't seem to understand that, and I believe right now we're starting to see some of the effects of that, the unintended consequences. So, we have things like cat ladies, these women. I know tons of these women. I have relatives like this. These women who are in their 30s or older who don't have children. And then perhaps the flip side of those kinds of people, for men, there are two types. There are guys who are just going out there and they're in the pickup community, those kinds of guys, or men going their own way. But the net effect of all of these people who have sort of lost their traditional role as either husband, father, or wife, mother, those people are now contributing to plummeting fertility rates. And that is going to be an enormous problem for developed countries, not just the West, but many other developed countries also. In the future, they're really going to have to address that issue, because that is going to cause a whole sort of series of cascading effects in other areas, in economics, for instance. The current economy, the whole way it operates, the welfare state, these kinds of things are simply going to be unsustainable with the current fertility rates and so on and so forth. So they don't understand. They think that they can just change one little thing, they can add or remove a particular thing, and everything will be fine. And they can't. These systems have taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to grow up. You can't just redefine marriage. You can't just redefine the roles of men or women, or even what men or women are. Then we get to the ethno-nationalists, and obviously a big one there is mass immigration, and for them, they rightly point out that you have these societies that in many cases have existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they have been fairly stable ethnically. Certainly in Europe, the kind of ethnic boundaries of Europe, more or less, were in place by the 11th century. There was a period prior to that of about half a millennium, or even slightly longer, where people were moving around a lot. All the different groups in Europe were sort of carving up the ancient world and creating a new order. But they basically settled down, and that was pretty much over by the 11th century. And then after that, there were only small movements, really until the 20th century. And even then, it was still fairly similar to how it was. And it's really only been since the second half of the 20th century that we've seen these really big dramatic changes, these huge influxes of people, a real sort of top-down approach to all of this, and it's causing big disruptions in the system. And we're going to see that there will be a sort of a reaction to that. I really believe there is going to be a very strong reaction to that within the next couple of decades. We're already seeing just the faintest traces of it right now. But I think that because the system is going to get very much out of equilibrium, it's going to trend back. It's sort of like if you push a pendulum very hard in one direction, it's going to swing back in the other direction. And again, leftists don't seem to understand this. When they do react to these kinds of things, they think, oh, these terrible racists, these terrible white racists, how dare they think this? Why would they think that? Why would they feel upset about losing their societies, their countries, and so on? Or, in many cases, they're not even aware of that, and it comes as a big shock to them every time something happens. And I think a series of even bigger shocks are coming. And I expect many leftists will be completely broadsided by this. They'll think, where did this come from? I mean, it's been building up for a while, obviously. But again, they can't seem to see a society, a country, a culture, all of that kind of thing as being a very unique system, and it's very complex. It has lots of moving parts, and they all have interactions with each other, and there are second and third and fourth and so on order effects. And if you change one thing, you not only affect that particular thing and the things immediately around it, but because there are second and third and fourth and so on order effects, it cascades through the entire system, and you can very quickly collapse the whole system. But again, they don't see that. And of course, there are more things I can say about all of this, but I'm trying to keep it relatively short. And then we get to, for instance, the techno-commercialists, or people who are kind of concerned about economics and so on. And again, I class myself mostly as a techno-commercialist. I sort of see myself as being somewhat in the other two legs of the trichotomy. But I'm mostly a techno-commercialist. And we can see that all of this market intervention, all of this Keynesian policy, all this manipulation of monetary policy and so on and so forth, is building up all of this sort of entropy in the system. And this is going to have to be flushed out of the system at some point. We're seeing that with Greece now. We're seeing just the beginnings of it in Greece. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it. And again, leftists think that they can just kind of take a very heavy-handed top-down approach to this, and they can look at this very complex system of economics and start meddling with it, tweak this thing, tweak that thing, and that there won't be a whole lot of cascading unintended consequences throughout the system. This seems very obvious to people like me that they're going to have big problems if they do that. Well, they have been doing that, so they are going to have big problems. And we can see that with debt, for instance. For a long time in history, debt was considered to be something that you handled with extreme caution, something that was a very dangerous thing, and it could unleash all sorts of big problems in society. So debt was regarded very much as a bad thing, or something that you had to regard with a certain level of unease and suspicion. Of course, it's not these days. Everyone, whether it's sovereign governments or parts thereof, local municipalities or so on, to big corporations and institutions, to individuals, families and so on, there's an absolute ocean of debt out there. Everyone is swimming in debt. And, debt can't go on indefinitely. It's going to have to be resolved at some point. There will be winners and losers. Either the people who borrowed the money will win, or the people who lent the money will win. Likely both of them will be burned in the process. We're seeing that with Greece at the moment. That's what that argument is basically about. Who's going to lose? Who's going to take the hit? The people borrowing the money, or the people lending the money, or maybe even both. And again, that seems really obvious. Likewise, the welfare state. This is a very recent invention, and it's really something that can only come with abundance and modernity. But even then, it's building up all this entropy, it's building up all this baggage in the system, and the welfare state, I believe, is unsustainable. And of course, the problem with the welfare state, even beyond its immediate effects, is that when it collapses, you have a whole lot of people who have become dependent upon the system. Again, leftists can understand that if you take a wild animal and you keep it in captivity, that from a very young age, that it's not going to be able to survive in the wild. If you release it back into the wild, it's going to be unable to do that. And yet they can't understand that with this, that if you create whole generations of people, or large segments of particular generations, who are completely unable to look after themselves, that when the whole system reaches a crisis point and the welfare state can no longer be sustained, that these people are going to literally be like taking some animal that's been raised in captivity and saying, right, go out and hunt for yourself now. You know, we fed you every day, but now you have to go and figure this out for yourself as an adult. I mean, what's going to happen there? It's pretty obvious what's going to happen there. And yet they can't see this. Now, why is this? Why don't leftists seem to understand this? I think there are three explanations. Without going into each in great depth, I think there are three possible explanations. The first one, which is probably the case for the majority of leftists, is that they're just stupid and ignorant. I really think that's the main reason. Many leftists are nowhere near as intelligent as they think they are. They think that just because they hold a particular political position, that by default makes them smarter than someone who holds another political position. But I actually think most of them are not that smart. Once you actually start probing them and asking them either to tell you some facts about something or to explain something, to describe and analyze a situation, they actually can't do that in many cases, even to do with their own causes, even for things such as the environment. Your average leftist out there who claims to be opposed to global warming and all the rest of it, if you actually said, all right, well, that's fine, but, you know, can you describe the carbon cycle to me, let alone all this other stuff? They wouldn't even know that. Now, so why are they so confident in their stupidity and their ignorance? Well, really, I think that a lot of politics is really just about signalling. When everyone gets to vote and you have a whole lot of people who are not particularly smart, then all they're really doing is signalling the tribe to which they belong, politically or culturally or so on. So I think those people are basically just signalling. They're saying, I'm one of the good guys, he's one of the bad guys. It doesn't matter what either of us actually knows, because I'm one of the good guys, he's one of the bad guys. All of that other stuff is irrelevant. Facts and so on. All of those things are irrelevant. My ability to articulate my position is irrelevant. And, you know, that's all been the result of an education system that has promoted that approach to things. But, you know, that's sort of the end point of mass education. That's the end point of universal suffrage and so on. You get a lot of dumb people who get to vote, and those people don't actually know anything, so all they end up doing is signalling. Now, of course, I do actually believe that there are some people on the left who are really malicious about this. They're actively trying to destroy these complex systems and bring in some sort of utopian vision or their own vision for their own power even. Those people are very dangerous, and I think those people in this, and this is a theme I think I will discuss in other talks. I have another one lined up that will discuss this. These people think they're a lot more clever and a lot more powerful than they really are, and those people are going to get a very rude awakening when it all collapses or breaks down, when these complex human systems really start to fall apart. So that's the end of the talk. As I've said several times, I'm going to go into some of these topics in more detail in subsequent talks. So I hope this has been a nice little taster for you. Thanks for listening.